With summer in full swing, you may feel the need to refresh your closet, but you don't want to waste any money on pieces you'll only wear once or for just one season. Then that's where Quince comes in. Their clothes are timeless, feel luxurious, look elevated, and the quality is way beyond what you'd expect for the price. It's the kind of wardrobe upgrade that just clicks. Think 100% European linen tops starting at $30, washable silk dresses and skirts, and soft cotton sweaters. Versatile warm weather pieces you'll reach for again and again. And the best part with everything with Quince is half the cost of similar brands. By working directly with top artisans and cutting out the middleman, Quince gives you luxury without the markup. Summer for me also means conferences. I'm still taking those Traveler 5 pocket pants along with me, which look good and feel good. But it also means lounging, and that's what that linen shirt is for. Give your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/traveler for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Hi, I'm Kristen Bell. And if you know my husband Dax, then you also know he loves shopping for a car. Selling a car? Not so much.
We're really doing this, huh?
Thankfully, Carvana makes it easy. Answer a few questions, put in your VIN or license, and done. We sold ours in minutes this morning, and they'll come pick it up and pay us this afternoon.
Bye-bye, truckie.
Of course, we kept the favorite.
Hello, other truckie.
Sell your car with Carvana today. Terms and conditions apply.
Amateur Traveler, episode 953. Today, Amateur Traveler talks about rainforest lodges and over-the-water bungalows, maroon communities and songbird competitions, UNESCO sites, and wildlife as we go to Suriname in South America. This is Chris Christensen from Amateur Traveler. Let's talk about Suriname. I'd like to welcome back to the show Mike Powers from smalloftheroad.blogspot.com, who's come to talk to us about the country of Suriname. Mike, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Great to be back on the show.
I say welcome back. If you don't recognize his name, it's because he hasn't been on since episode 667, talking about Sri Lanka, one of my favorite episodes. So Mike has certainly set the gold bar in terms of how to do an episode. So I was glad to see him come back. Mike, where is Suriname? I'm not sure that everybody knows where you're talking about.
Actually, that's a good place to start. I was a major in geography in university, and until a few years ago, I probably couldn't have told you where it's located, but it's in South America. Let's start with that. Towards the middle top part of South America, it's on the Atlantic Ocean, sandwiched in between Guyana and French Guiana. And then along the southern border is Brazil. And interestingly, it's the only Dutch-speaking country in the Americas. There are some colonies that are as well, but it has a bit of a Dutch heritage to it. I thought it's something worth mentioning as well.
And when you and I were in elementary school, we didn't call this country Suriname, as I recall.
Yeah, I'm not sure what it would have been. Honestly,
I think it was
me already.
Dutch Guiana.
Oh, Dutch Guiana. You know what? That sounds familiar. I think you're right. Yeah.
It's been a while since you and I were in elementary school. So,
yeah.
Excellent. Why should someone go to Suriname?
Another great question. Again, most people don't know much about it. I didn't. It's an undiscovered little gem. And for someone like myself who's traveled a lot, this was a place that I just thought, you know what? I'm just curious about it. I think I just want to go and check it out. And I started reading up on it. And it's really a spectacular place. And I'm just surprised it's not more popular. The number one draw there would be nature and ecotourism. There's a ton to see. Actually, over 90%, I've read as much as about 95% of the country is covered in rainforest.
Oh, wow.
And so ecotourism and the wildlife, especially a lot of birds, monkeys, etc., you're going to see a lot of that there. That's the first reason I'd go. The second one would be the diversity. So actually a very diverse country. And in particular, I found the maroon communities that live inland to just be fascinating. These are descendants of former escaped slaves as far back as 350 years from the Dutch plantations and living out in the interior. And that was really fascinating to see a little bit of that culture. And then finally, I'd say Paramaribo, which is the main city in Suriname. It's really, for all intents and purposes, the only main city in Suriname. Is a neat place to wander. There's a number of sites there. It's known now for its colonial heritage buildings. It's now a UNESCO World Heritage Site with these old buildings that date back to the 17th and 18th century. And you can just walk through these beautiful old wooden and some brick buildings as well there. So that was really another highlight for me. There's other things certainly that I'll touch on as we go through the show here, but
Okay.
those were the kind of the three highlights, I'd say.
Excellent. Let's get started then.
Okay.
What itinerary are you going to recommend for us?
So for itinerary, you're going to fly into the only international airport. It's about an hour south of Paramaribo, and I flew in from Miami with a quick stop over in Guyana. So for people from North America, that's likely where you need to make your way down to Miami. I flew in with Suriname Airways, which I had a really good experience with. And the other approach would be coming in from Europe, Amsterdam in particular, because it has that Dutch colonial
Sure.
history. Actually, I'd say easily at least half of the tourists there, it seemed like almost all the tourists I met were Dutch. And it was really surprising. I met one Canadian. That was it. No one else from North America the whole time I was there. Actually, I met one other American. Sorry. That was it. Everybody else, I think, was pretty much Dutch. Anyway, you'll fly into Paramaribo, and then you'll make your way about an hour long to get into the city. And that's where you'll base yourself. And typically when I travel, I like to do more independent travel, and I might do like a looping road trip somewhere, but it's not really set up for that. It's really unique. It's different. The whole industry tourism is set up on this hub and spoke approach where you base yourself in Paramaribo, and then you set up these excursions out into the interior. It might be for 2 or 3 days, and we'll talk about a few of those. Or there's a number of sites to see in and around Paramaribo within an hour's drive easily. So I found you typically would be either flying or driving out to see something in the interior, come back, have maybe a day in Paramaribo before your next excursion. And these excursions are typically, they're all inclusive. It includes the transportation to the site, the guides, the meals, the accommodation. So it's really easy to set it up. And that's how I structured it. So in terms of where to go, though, specifically to your question, I would recommend getting into the rainforest, into one of the remote lodges to see the nature. That was for me alongside of getting into see the maroon communities along the Suriname River. Those were the two real big highlights for me, I'd say. But also, you want to definitely, if you can, maybe extend a little bit past your typical 7 days. I try and get to 10, maybe even 2 weeks, 10 days or 2 weeks if you can, because there's also the Big Pan, which is an interesting area. It's this giant lagoon with a lot of bird life, these large flocks of birds that you can boat through. It reminded me of reading through National Geographic as a kid. It was just an incredible place to tour around as well. So those were the three areas out in the outlying areas. And then you're going to spend a lot of time, I think, in between those excursions in Paramaribo and seeing some of the history there, the old colonial buildings. There's a number of nature sites and other historical sites in and around the town as well. So in a nutshell, that's the approach I'd suggest in terms of laying out your itinerary. And I'll touch on some of the more common things, I think, during the podcast here, but I found the BRAT travel guide was an excellent resource. It's really the only English language guide out there that I'm familiar with anyways. You can download it onto an app and carry it along with you and reference it quite easily. And it was very thorough. It was actually one of the better guides I've read, quite frankly. So that would really be helpful in your planning as well.
Excellent. Let's go into a little more detail. Where do you want to talk about first?
Okay, for me, let's start with the highlights. The rainforest, might spend a little bit more time talking about that. And as I mentioned, about 95% of the country is covered in rainforest. So you want to get out to one of these interior lodges if you can. There's a few different options. I went to one called Paramaribo Nature Resort, which is on the Paramaribo River. It's a very remote area. I'll talk more about that, but there's a couple others I just mentioned. Paramaribo, again in the interior, you have to fly in. It's located in an indigenous community, so if you're also interested in the indigenous culture, that might be one to visit. For sites that you don't have to fly into, Voltsburg is a popular one. You drive, and then I think you have to take a boat trip as well to get to that one. And it's located in the Suriname Central Nature Reserve, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And it's very well known for the bright orange Guinean cock of the rock bird is a popular reason for going there to see that. And then finally, the Brownsburg Nature Park is another one that you can drive to. It's only a couple of hours outside of Paramaribo, so you could potentially do that in a day trip, but some people will go there overnight. It's maybe not quite as pristine, but if you just maybe don't have the time, it's a good option as well. But for where I went to Paramaribo, it is going to be a little more expensive, so the budget might play into it. I spent $1,200 US for 3 nights. So a little pricey, but for me, it was definitely worth it. You fly out of the domestic airport in Paramaribo, and it's about an hour-long flight. You see nothing but green underneath as you're flying. It's a really remote spot. You land on this long airstrip. It's just a grassy airstrip, and it's just literally located in the middle of nowhere. There's no communities, not even any indigenous communities in that area. And the only reason the airstrip exists is because they built it back in the late 50s as part of this Operation Grasshopper. There's about 7 of these airstrips around the country that geologists would come in to look for minerals. And I don't know if they still use it for that, but today some of these airstrips are being used for some of the local tourism. And so you land there, and the lodge is right along the airstrip and along the river. It's very nice. I stayed in the simplest building. It's the main lodge. It was the least costly, but also just very comfortable. And everything was included: meals, the accommodation, the guides, the flight in and out, and a very friendly staff. Most of the staff there are indigenous, although they came from other parts of the country. They do understand the natural environment and the wildlife there. And so that was really important, I think, not only be able to see nature through their eyes, but also learn a little bit about their culture. And it's very uncrowded. When I was there, I went there in mid-April, and there were only 2 groups of us, 7 per group, with 2 guides per group. And when we were out on the river and out and about, we didn't see anyone else other than people who either worked at or were staying at the lodge. There's no pollution, a very pristine environment.
And it looks like it would have to be supplied either by air or by the river, because there's no roads anywhere going anywhere near here when I look on Google Maps.
There are no roads. In theory, you could get there by river, but the guy who has been there since the start, Jerry, manages the place, was telling me that the only people who ever came up there by boat was some kind of military expedition from the Dutch military. So it's not an easy boat ride to get up there. It's quite a ways inland. So it is very remote. And they do have to fly everything in, pretty much. All the food they fly in. They do actually grow a few things on site, and they can get some things in the forest as well. But for the most part, they're going to fly everything. I found this was pretty common in all the resorts, actually. It was some variation of chicken and rice, typically. Occasionally, maybe some fish thrown in. Pretty simple food, but tasty. It was fine. So the excursions there really revolve around the river for the most part. Just getting out on the river, frankly, and the nice breeze, and bombing up and down in these traditional dugout canoes. And that was the mode of transport in all the lodges I stayed at in Suriname. They're made locally and with an outboard motor on the back. So you're flying up and down the river and stopping this. As our guide, Terrell, just had these eagle eyes. He could catch things, a lot of things I never even saw that he was pointing out, but monkeys and a lot of different birds as you're going along the river. The forest here is pure rainforest. It's these big, huge trees with the buttress roots and a whole layering of the canopy that supports this really diverse wildlife in the area. So that
and you see a lot of different birds. I see their website shows toucans and hummingbirds and all sorts of incredibly brightly colored things.
A lot of really, and those were for me some of the highlights, actually. The macaws, the toucans, the parrots, and others. I'll touch on some of them. They were always flying over the river. You'd see them perched up on the riverside. They're very noisy, especially the macaws. As much as it's a visual experience, it's also the sounds from the rainforest, whether it's the toucans squawking or whether it's waking up with all the birds around the lodge, or in the evening with all the insects and the tree frogs. A lot of interesting sounds was actually really part of the experience as well. So the river trips were the focus. Sometimes we'd go up little smaller tributaries. We stopped. We walked into a couple of different waterfalls. Moi Moi waterfall was probably the more beautiful one. I think that word does mean beautiful in Dutch. The other one was called the K3 waterfall that we visited. That was named by the geologists who were doing mineral exploration. I guess they haven't thought of a better name, but the K3 was the other one we went to. And we did a few hikes through the rainforest, as well as a night walk where we saw some neat stuff. And Terrell, our guide, took us into where they were building a dugout canoe on one of the hikes as well, which was interesting to learn a little bit about how they make those boats. And in the evenings, there was a bunch going on too. Like after dinner, they had these about a half a dozen tappers in the area. They were wild, but they're semi-tame too. So they would come up to the lodge sometimes and they would give them some treats, some watermelons or other fruits and things that they had leftovers. So every night I was there was a mother and her little baby tapper that would come right up to the lodge, and you could go right down and touch them and pat them. It was really a neat experience. Everybody would congregate around that when they came in.
Now, I've always said taper for that. Have I been pronouncing that wrong for last year?
No, taper, I'm sure. And I'll have to apologize for any mispronunciations in advance.
I just wondered if that's the way they were saying it there.
No, I think you're probably right. Taper would sound more natural. And we did see, as I mentioned, a lot of wildlife. The poison dart frogs, for me, were really spectacular, really bright. One of them was a bright green and blue. One called it the dying poison dart frog, and the other one was a three-striped. It was blue, green, and I think black, and just really vibrant, bright colors. And our guide, Taro, has actually picked up one of them. I wouldn't recommend that. I think he knew what he was doing. I think he was probably just trying to show off for us. But that was spectacular. And we saw a number of other tree frogs, especially on the night walk. I saw monkeys, howler monkeys. We actually probably heard those more than we saw them. We did see them once along the riverside, but you wake up to them in the morning, you could hear them out in the forest. Spider monkeys we saw as we were doing one of our nature walks, and they're very territorial. They were up in the very tops of the trees, breaking off these pretty large branches and dropping them down, trying to scare us away. Luckily, we didn't get too close to them. And then we saw the little squirrel monkeys and the brown capuchin monkeys as well, along with right around the lodge in the evenings, the capybaras would come out. They're the world's largest rodents, and they are quite large. Right. And the little agoutis that would be running around. We saw bats. This little proboscis bat are quite common in that area. First time we discovered them was going up one of these creeks, and we bumped into a log sticking out of the water, and they all, like a half a dozen of them, flew out. And apparently that's where they tend to just hide underneath a log that's coming out of the river so the land animals can't get to them. And in this area, you can also see jaguars. I didn't see one, but our guide, Saruman, had seen one last year. He was showing me some video. So it is possible. You'd have to be really lucky, though, I think, to see that. Huge diversity of birds. We talked about the toucans, macaws, and the parrots, but there were a ton of different varieties of herons there, including the largest heron in Suriname. They call it the cocoa heron. And the capped heron was another one we saw that was beautifully colored heron with this large feather that extended out of the back of its head. We saw kingfishers and swallows swooping down over the river, hawks typically up in the trees overlooking the river, black and yellow-headed vultures, and that you could see right at the camp. For some reason, he hung out there, probably being fed scraps. We saw the crested and green Oropendolas, and they build these long hanging nests, kind of like the weaver nest in the trees that you'd pass by quite often along the river. We heard more than we saw what they call the screaming piha. It's a very ordinary, small little ordinary bird, but it was by far the loudest thing in the forest, and you knew when you were anywhere close to one of those. And the last thing that was neat was Terrell came across a bright blue egg of a bird called the timamu. He called it a wild chicken. And that was interesting to see. We were there during Easter week, so that was almost like our, I guess, a rainforest Easter egg, if you want to call it that.
Are your business expenses playing hide and seek? With Uber for Business, the small spends that slip through the cracks, like rides and meals, go right where you need them. Because it integrates with leading expense platforms, you can say goodbye to surprise costs, missing dollars, or chasing receipts. Everything's track downable. Uber for Business. Make small steps that make a big impact. Learn more at uber.com/small steps.
Vitamin Water Zero Sugar has great taste, zero BS, and obviously zero sugar. For those with zero room in their calendar. Zero patience for slow walkers. Those who get 0 hours of sleep on a Saturday night. Have zero filter, zero given, and zero interest in grabbing a plain, boring water. Grab a delicious Vitamin Water Zero Sugar today.
We saw a lot, and actually I have photos of pretty much all this stuff on my Instagram account if people are interested in having a look at some of those. I will
link your Instagram account in the show notes, but it's Mike U. Powers is the Instagram.
Yeah, and I should give proper credits here. Chris, because I was taking photos with my iPhone and videos, and the photos were just horrendous for any of the birds. You'd see a little dot up in the
This
forest.
definitely sounds like something where you're going to want a telephoto lens here if you're going to go here.
Absolutely. So I would say this is my one slight regret. It was still very worthwhile, even without, but I would bring along a pair of binoculars if you can. I didn't have one.
Oh, sure.
And some good wildlife photography equipment. Luckily, I was very fortunate because the Dutch tourists there are very friendly, and I met a couple who sent me some photos of birds, and they did have the proper equipment. So that's what you'll see for the most part, especially when it comes to the birds, is thanks to them. And I must just do a bit of a shout out to the Dutch tourists as well, because all the sites I visited in Suriname, and a lot of them were guided. I was always with Dutch people, and they all spoke English, but I don't speak
Oh,
Dutch.
sure.
So the guide spoke both, and they were all willing to let all the guides were in English just for me, amongst like 10 other people who were Dutch. So they were very friendly that way, and I appreciate that. But we did see a few other things. Red-footed tortoises we came across on the trail, two different varieties of lizards, tarantulas, especially in the night walk. We saw these skeleton and pink-toed tarantulas. The skeleton one is like a black tarantula with these white stripes. It literally looks like a skeleton. That was cool. And tons of butterflies.
That sounds just a little creepy to run into a skeleton-looking tarantula on a night hike.
Yeah, it might not be. I might be scaring more people away than attracting them here, Chris. Sorry, but we kept our distance, and the guys were pretty good about letting us know if there was any danger. And I guess with the tarantulas, they're really not that dangerous. You don't want to get too close to them, but they're not going to attack you as long as you keep a bit of a distance. Tons of butterflies. I mentioned the blue morpho butterfly was especially spectacular. This bright metallic blue butterfly that would just fly by you very quickly along the river, especially where the waterfalls were. It was hard to get a good look at them, but you just see flashes of them going along the creeks in the river there. But they also had we saw that big owl butterfly. It has the colorings of an owl. We saw swallowtail butterflies, and one that I don't know the name of, but the wings were perfectly translucent. And a lot of butterflies. We saw these bright orange crabs in the river, which Terrell was telling us that the indigenous people do eat them. They're rather large. I was surprised to see that. And a lot of insects, scorpions, although I'm not sure that scorpions are actually insects, but we'll put them in that creepy crawler category, along with the cutter ants dodging around with the little bits of leaf that they're carrying. Cicadas, we got some up-close looks at cicadas. I think they were very common going by the sounds, because whenever the sun would come out, it would just be this very loud chorus of cicadas waffling through the forest, and a lot of other insects, large and small, that we came across. So that, in a nutshell, was my experience in the interior. And again, just a spectacular place. And I think I probably maybe went a little bit overboard there, because we're probably halfway through the episode, Chris. So I'll try and move it along.
That's all right. That's all right.
But the other one I really want to focus on, and this one again in maybe a little more detail, is the Suriname River. That's just a very unique place to me. I've never seen anything quite like it with the maroon culture. And just to give a little bit of perspective and background on that, the maroons are the descendants of escaped slaves. And you'll find them historically throughout much of the Caribbean, as well as Central America and South America. And I've traveled to a lot of those places, and I've come across them a little bit. Jamaica has a population, I think it's like less than 1,000 still in some of the interior areas. And there might be a few other pockets here and there, but in Suriname, there's literally over 100,000 maroons living there in very remote communities. It's about 15% of the population, a very vibrant population, a distinct part of their culture. And I had no idea that this existed. So getting into the Suriname River was one of the more popular places to see this. This is an excursion where you'll typically spend 2 nights, and you'll drive, I think it was about 2 hours, maybe 3 hours, to get to this little town called Ajoni, where you then jump into the dugout canoes and you power up the river for about an hour to get to the lodge I stayed at, or you can go further as much as a couple hours upriver to some of the other lodges. But the whole river has a series of small family-run lodges that you can stay at. And for the most part, you're likely going to have a local guide who knows the community and knows the culture and the history. And we did have one. Our guide been guiding for about, I think it was close to 25 years, he said, at the Enola Nature Resort was the name of the lodge that we went to. His name was Alberto. Fascinating guy. He also had a formal education in the city of Paramaribo, because back when he was young, Actually, even to go to high school, they didn't actually have a high school out where along the Suriname River. He actually had to go to boarding school in
Wow.
Paramaribo. But even to this day, there are no roads. Again, no roads that go up this river. The only way to get up and down it is by water. And there's about 20,000 maroons that still live along this part of the river, and about 64 small villages lining that river. You get into the lodge, and the lodge is very nice. I had my own little cabin. It's surrounded by rainforest. You're right on the river. Most of the staff there are maroons, and you'll get to do some really neat excursions there. The one that was most impressive and memorable for me was going to this small town. It's called, I believe, Aurora, or it might be New Aurora. I'm not sure which. But small little community that Alberto took us through. We were able to see the little wooden homes that they have there. Traditionally, it would have just been wooden buildings with thatched roofs. Today, they've got a little more modern building materials. You'll see more concrete floors, corrugated metal roofs, solar power now as well, but they still really retain their own unique culture in that area. It's still very remote. And there's about 2,500 people living in that village. Interestingly, the communities here are, as I mentioned, they're descended from escaped slaves back as far as 350 years ago. And these towns will typically revolve around an original group of escaped slaves. And they're a matrilineal society. So
Okay.
on the female side, their heritage going back generations would have grown up in these ancestral homes. And a lot of the inheritances, some of the political positions are more along the lines of the mothers being a matrilineal society as opposed to the father side. So a little bit different culturally there. As we walked through the village, we got to see the little school the kids were studying in, and they have challenges with that because a lot of the teachers are moving overseas, especially the Netherlands, where they can obviously get paid a little bit more. Now they do at least have one school, but it's only one high school in the area. So they're still trying to, I think, build up their educational system a little bit. Religion there, this town actually did have a church in it. Most of them don't, because about 80% of the Maroons are what they call traditional. Their religion is called Winti. It's more of a religion based with, I guess, some African influences that draws a lot
Right.
on nature and the worship of spirits. So we learned a little bit about the religion. We stopped in to see women making cassava bread, and that's a real staple there. They can hold the cassava bread for up to 6 months if it's secured properly to get them through the times when there's maybe not as much food. But the one thing that Alberto impressed on us is there's so much food that they never run out of food in the rainforest. The women are the ones who are primarily responsible for growing the food and making the food. And it's a polygamous society too, to a certain extent. So some men will have multiple wives, and the wives will generally drop the food off at their husband's home. And if they're there, the husbands quite often will be in a different community, depending on how many wives they have. And there'd be a lot of bachelors because of that. So the married men would actually share a lot of their food with the bachelors who lived in those communities too. So it was just a little bit of a different way of living that I wasn't familiar with. And there's a lot of other things he showed us as we were walking around. Some of the natural things too. He took us on a nature walk. They learned a lot from the indigenous communities there. So he showed us some of the medicines that they took out of the forest. And in fact, he was living proof of this because when he was young, he was given a shotgun, which is pretty common for Maroons, and he accidentally shot himself in the foot. And he showed us his foot, and a couple of the toes were pretty badly mangled, but intact. And he said that the Dutch doctor recommended that they amputate
Amputation.
three of his toes, but the family didn't want to do it. So they used traditional medicine. He showed us this yellow round, I guess it was from a palm tree. They call it the Amana palm or the Amana fruit. From the Amana pit, they create an oil and some kind of concoction that they use to cure his foot. And he said it took about 6 months, but his foot did cure, and his big toe looked perfectly recovered, and the other two toes were, I guess, intact. So I'm not sure I would recommend this necessarily. It sounded like it was a painful 6-month recovery from the way he described it, but it did actually work in the end, and he didn't lose his toes. So that was quite interesting. I know I focused a little bit more in the maroon community here, but there is actually a lot of nature to see, and a lot of the same things that I mentioned in the Rainforest Lodge we saw here. Maybe not quite as much just because there are more people. It's not quite as pristine, but you do see a ton of birds especially. And so it's also a great place to experience nature. And if you don't have the opportunity to go into a dedicated Rainforest Lodge, you're absolutely going to have an amazing wildlife experience here as well. We did see quite a few birds there in the morning when we did a walk around the lodge. We also did a little trip along the river, went swimming in the rapids. That was fun. So there's a few other things you do to round it out there. So really was an amazing experience, one I'd highly recommend. There are other lodges there.
How did
there
you
are others.
find this one? Did you find it on the internet, or did you use a local tour operator, or?
Yeah, it's a good question because originally I wanted to go to a lodge called Denpati, which has a very good reputation. And I was messaging back and forth with them for probably a few months actually. And they kept saying, check back later because we don't have anybody signed up yet for the time that I wanted to go. And the week before I was going to fly in, I just said, I got to find something. So I reached out to this agency called Orange Travel. And I probably should have done that a lot earlier because they made my life so much easier. For the same cost, they'll set you up at any of these lodges around Suriname or any kind of day trip. And I ended up doing 3 trips with them, and they were the ones that suggested Enola. And I had an excellent experience there as well as anything that I did with Enola. Okay. So it's definitely one I would recommend. There are a few other agencies as well. So I think, Chris, the third excursion that I'm going to talk about that I did was the Biggie Pay, and an amazing experience. You're going to, again, get to one of these, I call like a National Geographic moment there, where you're just immersed in literally thousands of birds and waterfowl as you're going through the mangrove there. So really spectacular. It was a 2-night, 3-day excursion. You're going to drive about 4 hours in this case to get to the town of Nickerie. The last hours along a really slow, bumpy road through the main rice growing area of the country. And when you get to Nickerie, you're going to transfer to a boat and head into the lagoon. It's maybe half an hour to an hour long boat ride to get in there. And you could stay at Nickerie and go in and out of the lagoon if you wanted, but most people, I think, tend to stay right in the lagoon in these overwater resorts. And that's where I stayed. I stayed at one called Akira Overwater Resort. For one, I really liked it because you're right there. You can just take in the nature and the views there. You're going to have your own little bungalow with a nice little deck out back and always a nice breeze. It is a bit hot there, not too bad, but the breeze was especially nice to keep some of the bugs away and to keep things a little bit cool. And one thing I should mention, Chris, is probably a lot of people, they might be wondering about the mosquitoes. I should probably touch on that. I did bring bug spray and I used it occasionally. I honestly didn't use it that much anywhere in Suriname. I think maybe in the rainy season, the bugs are a little worse. And I would definitely bring some. I did use it, like I say, but it wasn't too bad. But anyways, the breeze also helped keep them away. And you're really out in the middle of the lake anyways. It's about a 5-kilometer long lagoon, I would say, but it extends well beyond that. When you go out for your excursions, you'll head out through the lagoon and then through these narrow little channels winding through the mangroves. And there's a few spots in particular where, like I say, thousands of these, a lot of egrets especially, will congregate around some of the mangrove stands and just buzzing by those and taking that in. For me, it reminded me of looking at National Geographic as a kid. It was really spectacular. And we saw a lot of other waterfowl there. I think some of the things that we saw included a lot of herons.
Yeah.
Bright red scarlet ibis were really spectacular too. The wood stork, we saw a wood stork flying through over us there. Ospreys, cormorants, terns, ducks, hawks, woodpeckers, parrots, and others. Our guide literally every minute or two would be calling out, oh, there's this and there's that. And I didn't keep track of all of them. But if you're a birder, by the way, if you're a birder, like Suriname is going to be a paradise for you. There's so much to see on the bird front. And we did actually see an anteater as well as we were going through one of the little channels right up close to us in one of the mangroves. Yeah, that was the Biggie Pen. We also did a little night excursion there. We got to see a bunch of the caimans in the channels. We also did, I should say some of us did a excursion out into the middle of the lagoon for a mud bath. I decided to skip that one myself. But yeah, this lagoon is very shallow. It doesn't get up much over your hip. So you could literally walk across, as they say, and not recommending that, but it's all muddy. And so that was one of the other things that some of the folks did.
It's funny you say that. As I'm looking at the picture, you describe an overwater bungalow. And there are 3 things that I noticed that are different here than what people may be picturing from your Tahiti overwater bungalow. One is it's not attached to the shore. 2 is the water is not blue.
Yeah.
Even in Google Earth, it's all brown.
Yeah.
And then they've got this observation tower in the
Yeah.
middle of the
Yeah, which is neat.
vast.
I think that's more of gives you a nice view of the
Yeah, yeah.
surrounding mangroves. You're not going to see too many birds from that observation deck itself because you're kind of like you're in the middle of the lagoon and there's not a lot right close by.
Interesting.
But you're right, the water there is all brown. The rivers are all brown. If you look at, like you say, Google Earth along the coastline, it's all brown. You might have noticed I
Nobody's
have not
snorkeling off the
Mitch,
back of their overwater bungalows.
and you're not going to find any pristine blue water sand beaches along the coast there either.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's not going to be the kind of place you go to sit on the beach or maybe go golfing. Although there is a 9-hole golf course in Paramaribo, by the way, George, if you have to get your round of golf.
I suspect there may be some good golf courses closer if that's what you're looking for.
There's only one. There's only one in all of Suriname.
No, closer to home than going to Suriname.
Yeah.
You're going here for the birds and the other.
Yeah, it's the wildlife. It's all about the wildlife.
Exactly.
So I think we better move on and talk a little bit more about some of the stuff that's closer to Paramaribo, the main city. And we'll start with just the ones that are, say, within an hour or so of the town where you need to either go on an excursion. You can line that up again with Orange, or you can do it on my own. I did a bit of both. I did some independently because I kind of want to mix and match some stuff. And the first one I'll mention is Bramspund. It's a small beach just downriver of Paramaribo, about 30-minute boat ride. At the end where the river flows into the ocean, there's a beach there where you can see the sea turtles. You go out in the evening. So I went there on a tour, and we actually saw probably about a half a dozen to a dozen green turtles as we walked along the beach with our guide. You do have to do this with a guide, of course. Your best time to see the turtles are going to be between March and July. So I was there in mid-April, which was perfect because it was just before the rainy season. So I was able to see the turtles. In addition to the green turtles, they do have leatherbacks pretty commonly there, as well as hawksbill and olive ridleys, a little less frequently, but they are there as well. And with the guide, he took us up to one of the large mature ones. And these are big turtles. That was the thing that surprised me the most. They get to be about 3 feet long and weigh 400 to 500 pounds. And managed to drag themselves up the beach and dig a deep hole. And we saw one as it was laying its eggs. They lay about 100 eggs. And they'll come up the beach multiple times. And from what I learned, only about 1 in 1,000 of those eggs will eventually survive to adulthood. But it was neat. You use the red light. You're very quiet. It's very difficult to disturb the turtles when they're nesting because they go into a bit of a trance when they're laying the eggs. But you have to be quiet and you have to be respectful. And that was really a neat experience.
With a major selection of the looks your kiddos love starting at just $4 in the Walmart app, a new school year means a stylish new them. Who knew? Find skater skirts and Crocs that say, I'm casual but cool. Sparkly sneakers that say, it's my classroom, you're just learning in it. And preppy polos that say, I'm the teacher's pet, even if they're mommy's menace at home. Find their favorite styles starting at just $4 in the app. The Walmart you thought you knew is now new.
USAA knows dynamic duos can save the day, like superheroes and sidekicks, or auto and home insurance. With USAA, you can bundle your auto and home and save up to 10%. Visit USAA.com/bundle.
Bundle savings are off total premium, not available in all states or in all situations. To qualify, auto policy must be active prior to property policy issue, subject to change. Restrictions apply. Membership eligibility and product restrictions apply and are subject to change. USAA means United Services Automobile Association and its affiliates, San Antonio, Texas.
The other thing I'll mention, Chris, on your original, you have one other episode on the kind of the 3 Guyanas combined.
I do, way back.
Yeah, way back. The guy did go to Galibi Nature Reserve, which is in the far northeast country of the corner. That might be something to consider too if you're really into that, and that's an important visit for you. The other thing that was nice about this trip is you got to go out on the boat. A lot of people will go out just to see the dolphins, and we got to combine that because we did see some of the smaller Guianean dolphins, which live in the river in the estuary there. So that was neat, along with the river there is lined by mangroves. We saw scarlet ibis there as well as some other herons and other birds. So again, more birds. The black skimmer was the one actually we also saw there. They tend to come out at nighttime and they just skim very close along the water with their beak literally just along the top of the water trying to catch a little fish or an insect, so that they were neat to see swooping around. And I might mention just with this beach, with global warming, it's been getting smaller, unfortunately, over the years. So just you'll actually have to check when you go to make sure that the turtles are still able to nest there because they've actually lost some of the beaches along that area of the Atlantic, unfortunately. I'll touch on just a couple of other nature-related things you can do near Paramaribo. One is the Green Heritage Sloth Sanctuary. I visited that. It's about an hour's drive outside of the city, and you'll get to learn about the good work that they do there. With the urban sprawl in Paramaribo, there's more and more sloths, as well as anteaters and even the occasional armadillo that gets stranded or injured. So they'll take them in, rehabilitate them, and release them back into the wild. And when I was there, they did have a two-toed and a three-toed sloth that we could see. So that was neat.
And the two-toed sloth is a sloth whose parents gave it a shotgun when it was young or something.
And did not use the local medicine to cure it. Exactly. The Neotropical Butterfly Park is another spot. I was impressed by the butterflies, as I mentioned, but they actually have close to 1,500 different butterflies in Suriname. So that's a good place if you want to see a little bit more of that, and some of the insects that they have in the displays is worth mentioning. There's one other in terms of nature, is a Pepper Pot Nature Reserve. That's a very popular place. So if you only had a few days in Suriname, maybe you're going across all the Guianas, you could still have a very authentic wildlife experience right in just a half an hour outside of town in this Pepper Pot Nature Reserve. It's an old plantation that's been returned to a natural environment, and I saw monkeys there and lots of birds, butterflies, etc., just walking along the trails on my own. You could do a tour there, and I'm sure you'd see a lot more with a guided tour, but I was just on my way out. I wanted one last blast of the rainforest before I headed out, so I just walked through on my own. A lot of the Dutch you'll see biking through there as well. It's popular to do. But moving on, there are a few historical things to see. The plantation visits are very popular. In fact, there is one next to the Pepper Pot Nature Reserve is the Pepper Pot Plantation you can stay overnight in. If you combine that with a visit to the reserve. But there's another popular one that I stayed at called the Frederickstorp Plantation. And I stayed overnight. It's beautiful. They've restored these beautiful old wooden buildings. It's a really spectacular spot. It's surrounded by gardens. A very nice place to stay. I think it's important to recognize that this was a plantation, and certainly in the guided tours that I had, you'll learn about that, and pretty horrendous conditions that not just the slaves, frankly, but also the indentured laborers that came primarily from Java and India had to endure there. And be aware of that, be sensitive to it. Some people might not be comfortable with that visit. I always think it's important to understand a little bit of our history collectively. I think that helps us prevent things like this from happening in the future. So I was comfortable with it myself. The guides there grew up in that area. Their families extend back to those times. And so they have a lot of interesting stories that they'll share with you. Fort New Amsterdam is another one. When I went by seeing the river dolphins, you go by it by boat, but I also stopped in and did a tour there. There's the actual fort itself, there's not much left. You can just see the outline of this star-shaped embankment along the river. But inland, if you go inland a little bit, they have an open-air museum, which is really interesting, and they've got quite a few things to see there. These old gunpowder buildings. The first one they actually built, they designed it based on specs from the Netherlands. It didn't work at all. The ammunitions just had way too much moisture. So they ended up building a second one that was much thicker. So you can visit those. There's some plantation era artifacts, the metal vats that they used to boil down the sugar cane. There's an old plantation house you can visit. And there's also some World War II relics. During World War II, there was a small contingent of American soldiers that came in to protect the river and Suriname from invasion because of the bauxite that they mined there for the aluminum, which was really important as they were building all the airplanes. That was something else you can see there. And along with a prison, an old prison complex. After the fort lost its military function, they converted it into a prison, so you can see the old prison buildings. The last site is a little bit further, it's probably an hour and a half out, but I'll mention it because I didn't get to it, but I do want to mention it just because it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's called Jodensavan. It's an old Jewish community that is one of the earliest communities in Suriname, actually, dating back to Sephardic Jews who were fleeing Portugal during the Inquisition. They moved there in the early 1600s, and at the time it was one of the larger Jewish communities in the Americas. There's not much to see today because by, I think it was around the 1850s, the sugar plantations were in decline because of outside forces. And then they had a big fire in the town. And after the fire, everybody just deserted it. So all you can see today is the remains of the big synagogue that they had. You can see the tombstones in the graveyard. So I don't actually think there's a ton that you can actually see there, to be honest. I would have liked to do it, frankly. I just didn't have time. But I'd suggest going on a guided tour. The one guide that I read about, and I was trying to set something up with, was Marina da Costa with tours with Flair. She is descended from early Jewish settlers and is apparently very knowledgeable about the area. So that would be the way to do it. So you learn something about the history there. The last thing that I want to touch on is with the way tourism's set up there, you're going to find yourself in Paramaribo between excursions, whether you like it or not. You may not even have to plan any additional time there, frankly. So on those days that you're there, there's a lots to see, which is a good thing. The historic core, the UNESCO World Heritage Site, these old wooden and brick buildings, you can't help but miss. You'll walk through them probably multiple times, built in the 17th and 18th century. The one building I thought was the most impressive was the presidential palace. It was built in 1730, a big wooden structure, beautiful building. It's right on what they call Independence Square, which, by the way, if you happen to be there on a Sunday morning, they have songbird competitions you can take in there in Independence Square. And then on the opposite...
Wait, songbird competition. So I'm bringing my pet songbird.
You could bring your pet songbird, you have one, or like most tourists, the locals, they'll bring their songbirds in a cage. They're all male songbirds.
Okay.
And what they do is they put the two cages up next to each other. And because they're male songbirds, they get into a competition and they start singing. And they just judge it based on, I think, how long they go and maybe the clarity. And it's an interesting thing to take in if you get a chance. And in behind the presidential palace is what they call the palm tree garden. There's probably about, I'd say, 1,000 palm trees, old palm trees, mature, that you can walk, beautiful spot to walk through. Along one end of the park, there's a little canal with restaurants and cafes and things that you can stop in at. You can continue on down to the water. There's a river walk there. When I was there, I couldn't go because they were rebuilding it. So hopefully by the time anyone listening to this is there, they'll be done with that work, and it'll be, I'm sure, a really nice walk along the water there. It's right down close to Fort Zeelander as well, which is probably the oldest structure in the city. It goes way back, and it's a neat building to tour. They have some displays in a museum in the building itself, and that was interesting. And then a little further up the river is the Central Market and the Maroon Market. And I always love going to markets, but I was actually really impressed by the size of what their Central Market was. As big as just about, I think, any market I've ever been to. It had this really big building, 2 floors. The bottom floor was mostly vegetables, the top floor clothing and textiles. And then they had another separate building with a big high ceiling that was the fish market. And they had a few other smaller collection of buildings that were connected. And it was all surrounded by this narrow alleyway that snaked around. And there were stalls along there. And you could just wander around there. And it, like I mentioned earlier, I think it's a very diverse culture there. You have the Creoles and the Maroons. You have a lot of Javanese and Indian. People came in as indentured servants. They're major parts of the population now. There is, of course, the European, the Dutch, and also small indigenous communities. So a lot of variety as you're walking through there, both in terms of what they have to sell and the vendors themselves, and just a really neat experience. And right next door to it is the Maroon Market itself, which is a little smaller, but that's where you'll see a lot of the things that we saw as we were doing our nature walk. They'll bring in the plants that they use for different medicines and for different rituals. And a fair number of Maroons now also live in Paramaribo, so they're catering to that community today. There's also a large cathedral, Catholic cathedral, the St. Peter and Paul Cathedral, which they say it's the largest wooden structure in the Western Hemisphere. And I actually had to Google that one because I didn't quite believe it. But when I brought it up on Wikipedia, in fact, it does make the list. It didn't say it's the big.
I can't think of anything larger because we tend to build in concrete or stone or something.
Yeah, there are a bunch of buildings listed there, but it did make the list, and it is impressive. The thing that was most impressive about it is the interior. They've stained it, so they've kept the natural color of the wood. They haven't painted over it. So it's very different, unlike any church I've ever visited, quite frankly. And just make sure you'll want to probably check the mass schedule because it's not always open. I was there during Easter, so I actually went in during the Easter services, and I could take it in then. And just spectacular. While we're on the topic of religion, I mean, there are a lot of different Hindu temples around the city and mosques as well. And just down the street is the historic Jewish synagogue, the Neva Shalom synagogue. When a lot of those people left Odensvon and they moved to Paramaribo, they created a community there. And this beautiful old wooden structure, the current one dates back to about 1840s, is a beautiful building with a balcony that surrounds it. And the thing that was most unique about it is it had a sand floor. Like the floor was made out of sand. And that was the guy who took us around. And you do have to arrange for this in advance, by the way. the caretaker was explaining that had something to do with the symbolism of the Jews walking through the desert with Moses. But he also said, just from a functional standpoint, that it helps prevent fires because candles falling down and wood
Sure.
catching on fire is an issue. And even to this day, quite frankly, when I was there, and I have photos of this, just not that I need proof or anything, but there was a pretty big fire in the city. 3 of these old historic buildings unfortunately burned down. They were able to contain it and it didn't spread beyond that, but it's still a risk right to this day. That was really quite fascinating. And right next door, I don't think you can visit it, but probably the city's most prominent mosque is right next door to the synagogue. I think it tells you something about the religious tolerance of this city. Hopefully they still have that today, but they even share a parking lot. So that was interesting to see as well. The last thing I'll mention is just places to stay in Paramaribo, because I stayed at a few different places as I was coming in and out of the city. Probably the most popular is called the Torarica, and it's actually 3 separate lodges, but all run by the same company. There's the Royal Torarica, the Torarica Resort, and the Eco Torarica. I stayed at the Royal Torarica and the Torarica Resort, and they're both very beautiful. They have nice swimming pools. I like the Royal in particular just because it had this very kind of serene area around the pool, surrounded by gardens, and they even had a little artificial pond with some of the natural freshwater fish that live in Suriname. Breakfast was included always, so you could take your breakfast outside in the gardens, and that was a really nice. When I first arrived in Suriname, that was my first experience, so maybe that has lingered with me a little bit longer. And the other 2 that I'll mention that I stayed at, and there's certainly others, check the Brad guidebook, it has good reviews, but the Hotel Palacio is right in the old historic area. It's a newer building, but it's built to look like the old historic buildings. And then there's the Holland Lodge, which was another very comfortable lodge just outside of the historic core that I stayed at. So just a few thoughts for places to stay there. And that pretty much kind of what I wanted to touch on, Chris.
Excellent. Anything else we should cover in terms of logistics before we get to some of our wrap-up questions?
Logistics, I would say cell phones and Wi-Fi, no problem in Paramaribo, but once you get outside of the city, you're
Sure.
going to be lucky if you get a cell signal, and in many of the remote lodges, they don't even have Wi-Fi. Payments can also be a bit tricky, so not everybody accepted credit cards. For some of the lodges, I had to pay by wire transfer before I arrived. I was even having problems paying for my flight with Suriname Airways. I finally had to reach out. I found somebody on LinkedIn, the CEO actually. He also happens to be a pilot. And anyway, he hooked me up with somebody. We had to do a manual credit card entry because it wasn't nothing to do with the airline. It's just the banks don't have very good systems. Even the local McDonald's weren't able to accept my Canadian credit card. So bring some cash. They generally will accept US dollars and euros as well as the local currency.
Okay. Interesting. Excellent. We're getting to our wrap-up questions. I think you know what's coming here. You're standing in the prettiest spot in Suriname. Where are you standing and what are you looking at?
I think I got away with this on the last episode. I'm not actually standing, floating, if that's okay. So this time I'm floating in the waterfall, the Mwai Mwai waterfall, along
Which means beautiful.
Which means beautiful. A small river in the surrounded by rainforest with these bright orange crabs walking along the shoreline there, and the beautiful bright blue morpho butterflies passing by you overhead. Just a really serene moment. And fortunately, the spider monkeys weren't there, so they weren't dropping anything down on top of me from up high. But that was a really beautiful spot, I'd have to say.
Excellent. And one thing that makes you laugh and say only in Suriname.
I would say I had to go back to Alberto in my visit to Nola, as he's taking us around to explain all the different plants and their uses. The one that he showed us was this plant, I forget what he called it. He said that this one is what we use for promoting hair growth. And if you see the photos of this
now,
guy,
Alberto was bald.
He was totally bald. And we gave him a bit of a hard time over that. He said, I like my head just the way it is. I've never used it. And I think maybe he lost a little credibility on that. But we had a good laugh. Yeah.
That's funny. Excellent. And if you had to summarize Suriname in just 3 words, what 3 words would you choose?
I would say nature, of course, seems to be a theme there. Diversity, as we're talking about the very diverse cultures, including the maroon culture there. And undiscovered. Like I say, I knew nothing about this place, and I'm just so shocked how undervisited it is, especially by North Americans. The Dutch have figured it out, but it's a beautiful spot, especially if you've been to places like Costa Rica and you enjoy it. I had a deeper, more immersive visit to see nature here than I did even in Costa Rica. So undiscovered would be the third word.
Excellent. Excellent. Our guest again has been Mike Powers, and we'll put a link to his Instagram where you can see a picture of Alberto and some of the other things that we've been talking about here, as well as a link to the article on his blog, smalloftheroad.blogspot.com, about Suriname. Why small of the road, Mike? I forgot to ask if I asked before.
There is a reason. When I was a child, we were driving across the U.S. It was way back in 1976, to age myself.
Mm-hmm.
But my father was teaching for 6 months in Nevada, and we had this little pop-up camper, and so we're going all over the place visiting national parks, and that's really where a lot of my love for travel came from. And
Mine too.
It was just as we were going through Alberta, we got lost, and we asked this RCMP officer we came across, trying to get some directions, and he said, just head down to the small of the road and then turn left. And so we had it down that way. We could never figure out what he meant by small of the road. So I like to think that I'm still looking for the small of the road and continuing that journey.
Excellent. Mike, thanks so much for coming back on Amateur Traveler, giving us another wonderful episode and sharing with us your newfound love for Suriname.
Thanks very much, Chris.
The McDonald's snack wrap is back. You brought it back. Ranch snack wrap. Spicy snack wrap. You broke the internet. For a snack. Snack wrap is back. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
How do you top your love for your cat? With a cascade of decadent savory gravy over a mouth-watering mousse pâté. Fancy Feast gems. 2 gourmet pâtés in one convenient pack. Simply peel and plate to reveal a pyramid shape that makes eating delightful and pamper her with an experience as extraordinary as she is. Turn the everyday into the extraordinary with Fancy Feast gems.
Special thanks to the patrons of the show who help support Amateur Traveler financially. This is my day job now, and I like it, but I appreciate those who help me do it. If you're interested in becoming a patron of the show, go to patreon.com/amateurtraveler. I'm just back from China, from Western China, mostly the Gansu province. You'll hear more about that coming up on the show. And I'm just about off to Peru, to the Peruvian Amazon. So it's a busy travel season for me. You'll hear about that also probably in about a month or so after this comes out. If you're interested in traveling with me, there are still spaces available in the 2026 trip to Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. Go to amateurtraveler.com/trips to learn more or drop me an email. New on the Amateur Traveler blog are articles both about Old Town Edinburgh, a memorable UNESCO site, and things you need to know before you move to Mexico. Check those out. And with that, we're going to end this episode of Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to chris2x@gmail.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. And thanks so much for listening.
I got to see one more cathedral.